Welcome everyone to this, the first of the A4S live at COP28 broadcasts. I'm really pleased to be welcoming you to this broadcast. I'm Jessica Friess, A4S's Exec Chair, and apologies for starting a few minutes late. For anyone who's ever done a UN conference, you'll know that the queues are one of the things that you have to navigate. And as I found out today, queues not just getting in, but also getting out. One of the things that has been happening today is a gathering of world leaders for the UN Climate Action Summit. And the aim of the summit is to try and raise ambition. Not only world leaders are here, but also CEOs and others from the business, finance, and civil society community. For this, the annual UN Conference of the Parties, to look at how we tackle the climate crisis. Now, today's conference was opened by a speech from His Majesty King Charles. And 2 years ago, he shared a message to our A4S live from COP26 broadcast in Glasgow. And then what he said was that finance really does hold our future in its hands. Unless we can unlock private sector resources, innovation, and finance, with the public sector setting a framework of incentives and regulation, we simply do not stand a chance of solving the existential crises we've engineered for ourselves. Now today, in the opening, His Majesty the King was reflecting on where we've got to. And I think a key takeaway for me, a key headline that is something for all of us to reflect on, is the statement that he made in 2050, our future generations will not be asking what we said. They will be living with the consequences of what we did or didn't do. So with that in mind, I'm really pleased to be welcoming three fantastic speakers to walk through some of the progress that we have made, what we haven't, and where we need to be getting to. This year's COP is all about a global stocktake, looking at the kind of progress that we've made and setting the pathway for the additional commitments we need to be making over the next couple of years. Since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, we know that we have made some progress. According to the latest UN emissions gap report, which was released in the build-up to COP28, the increase in projected global emissions have reduced from a 16% rise that we were seeing at the Paris Agreement, now down to a 3% rise. But emissions are still rising, and we know that we need about a halving over the period to 2030, and that is not a long time. So a sign of progress being made, that we're bending the curve, but not fast enough. And at the moment, we're on a trajectory towards an uninhabitable, uninsurable 3-degree world. As the UN Secretary General said in the opening to COP28, we're living through climate collapse in real time. This year has seen communities around the world pounded by fires, floods, and searing temperatures. And the impact is devastating. Record global heating should send shivers down the spines of global leaders, and it should trigger them to act. One action already agreed yesterday was the agreement of a loss and damage fund, with countries pledging at least $420 million to help countries most vulnerable to climate-related disasters like flooding and droughts. This is important not only as a recognition that those impacts are already with us and set to grow, but also that they're impacting some of the least able to respond. So I'm going to now explore some of these themes, look at the progress, and where we might see further action over the coming 2 weeks during COP28. Our three speakers are Mark Gough, the CEO of the Capital Coalition, Shaun Tarbuck, CEO of ICMIF, representing the insurance sector, and Rob Turner here in the studio with me in Dubai, partner at PwC. So, Rob, I'm going to come to you first. One of the things that I've always followed is PwC's Net Zero Economy Index. I think it really provides that sense of whether we're making progress or not, and the scale of the challenge that we're still facing. So the 2023 report suggests year-on-year decarbonisation rate of 17.2% to 2050 is necessary to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which of course is set out in the Paris goal as the ambition that we need. Last year, it was 2.5%. So we're pretty far off that target. During the pandemic, we still saw about an 8% fall, and that was when the global economy was completely shut down. So a huge uphill task to face. Can you just set out for us what the scale of the transformation that we need to see is if you look at those kind of numbers?
Sure. The numbers, and it goes the same as the UN stock take, right? The numbers are what they are. It sets out very plainly, very clearly, we're off target. You can read that very negatively and conclude that we're going to miss those targets, conclude that the world hasn't got their head around the problem, conclude that actions aren't really having the impact that they should have, right? That's, you've got to be very plain and simple about where we've gone, where we've come in the last 8 years, okay? Actually, I would read momentum differently, however. I think we typically have to understand that investment timelines are, if you're going to build something big and new and complex, it typically takes companies 2 to 3 years to line up the money and the planning, another 2 to 3 years to deliver. So if all the right decisions had been taken in Paris, everyone had been aligned, all the financing was there and all the technology was there, well, we would see a different trajectory. But it wasn't possible at that point to make all of those decisions. It wasn't possible at that point to get us onto the right trajectory. But where are we right now? And that's where I feel quite different about the numbers. Momentum and the positivity that's actually coming in some of the discussions already at COP28 tell us that we could accelerate from here because we've had those 8 years of planning. We've had time for people to get their head around what possible looks like, and the answers coming out of what possible is are very positive. I'll just give a couple of examples. Doability, okay? Doability, if you think about that as, is there the right technology and are there the solutions? Are they affordable? And the companies have the experience to deliver them. Well, on that, it looks pretty good, right? The economics around generation on renewables are good. The technologies are there and available, and therefore it's entirely affordable, and we can see real momentum in delivery. So if you take the fact that renewables last year, the IEA told us the spending on renewables exceeded oil and gas comfortably, that's going in the right direction. So doability looks pretty good. The other thing I would say is that the debates shifted, somewhat helped by geopolitics, but also helped by simple economics, that often in the past the debate's been high carbon to low carbon, we must do it. It's a set of environmental imperatives. Now, those are all correct. I don't challenge those. But are the economic arguments clear enough? I think right now we can look at affordability and energy security as equally important points on the triangle as decarbonisation. Now, if you think about Europe in the energy crisis, affordability and security. You think about brownouts in the US, affordability, security. Think about emerging markets and needing to understand their growth trajectory, affordability, security. So if you say the world is now starting to think about climate change, not just in terms of the green imperative, but affordability and security, and then you say, which I'd assert, technology is there and it is affordable, then I think we're getting into a much better place. So I would say that we're accelerating. Mm-hmm. The general tone at COP is private sector engaging around that. And I think you can talk to companies and CFOs and not say, you need to do this for environmental reasons. You can do this, you'll improve your business performance, and you'll decarbonise. So I'm very optimistic.
And I think that optimism, but a realistic optimism, is really important, because I think if we look at some of the headline numbers, it's very easy to be paralysed and think this is pointless.
Absolutely.
So just thinking of that positive momentum and that positive trajectory, and certainly, if I think back 2 years ago, the focus was all on setting commitments amongst the private sector, and you had a huge percentages of the big corporates, the big investors, making very bold claims. But it was that transition from commitment to delivery that I think we are starting to see. And as you say, in some of the key technologies, that's really accelerating. Where are you seeing some of the remaining barriers? So what do you think people really need to be focusing on to then deliver on the potential of the technology? And as you were saying, the sort of doability of it, it is happening, but it's still not happening as fast as it needs to.
No, look, I fully agree. So the assertion doesn't quite work. So if I can sit here confidently saying technology is great and affordability is great, then surely companies would naturally be filling up the equation and just doing it. It's hard, and it's hard often to do with what we in our thinking are calling awareness. It's a simple question of, can you find the number, can you get behind the number, and can you prove up the economics I'm referring to? Now, awareness is actually quite good, in my view, on the supply side of the energy equation. So there's a lot of thinking, a lot of capital pointed at upstream supply. So wind and solar, and there's good momentum now. I referred to that in terms of global investment. The awareness, I think, is quite poor on the company side, and that's often because energy and energy costs is quite hidden in an organization. In accounting terms, it sits below the line. It's an operational cost. Companies are programmed to think much harder about 5% growth rather than a 10% reduction in energy costs. So the thing that has to happen is we've got to get companies in general thinking harder about their energy costs and focusing on those, and sometimes think about energy more than carbon.
Yeah.
Right. So if you could consolidate most companies' energy use, think about that as a demand side conversation rather than supply side. I think the numbers coming out for what can be achievable demand side are incredible. I'll give you an example. There's an estimate from Schneider Electric, who does a lot of work in the building space, saying they think that OECD buildings could be targeting 30 to 40% reduction in their energy use just by a retrofitting program. And I say just, retrofitting is not one thing, it's thousands of interventions and a managed process over many years and discipline to keep that energy use down over time. But it's 40%. So you come back to the word awareness, you've got to find the number, you've got to measure your energy use, develop a program, and then instigate continuous improvement in the same ways you would do with any business cost. And I think it's deliverable.
And certainly those kind of percentages in terms of energy efficiency, when we're experiencing a cost of living crisis and inflation, must be hugely attractive to anyone.
They should be. It's interesting. The trend rate of energy efficiency gain is, so the business as usual, companies doing what they should do, running themselves well, is somewhere between 1% and 2%. The IEA is saying we would need to get to the net zero pathway that the IEA has talked about between 4 and 5%. I think they're saying 4.4% at the moment. So the gap between BAU and net zero is to double or triple the pace of energy efficiency. Is that possible? Well, absolutely. Because if you take my 40% number in buildings, well, that's just annually achieving 4.5% a year for the next decade. It's quite doable. Technology's there. Companies have got to pull their focus in, measure their energy use, and just get that number down.
So, Rob, if I can come back to you just for a final comment. We're right at the beginning of COP28. So what are you hoping for and hoping that COP will be able to deliver in terms of next steps?
There are lots of things that COP is aiming to do, all around policy and other global things. I won't talk about that, actually. I think for me, the area where I'd love to see progress, and I feel that progress can be made, is that wider non-energy economy, private sector ownership of the problem, but also engagement and belief that they can make it work. So I come back to what I said at the beginning. If they can see the technology and they can see the economics adding up, let's get that private sector saying, we'll step up, we can do it across all industries, all businesses, all geographies. There's a lot of positivity at COP. There's a lot of companies turning up to say, we think we can do it. So if we can capture that positivity, that's a great outcome.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Shaun, if I can come to you next, you represent the insurance sector and particularly the cooperatives and mutual part of the insurance sector, which certainly from the work that we've done is really leading quite a lot of the work, both in terms of how do we build in resilience and how do we make sure that we're scaling up the kind of investment that we need. Now, we know that we need, 95 trillion US dollars to transition to net zero just from the emerging markets alone. So huge volumes of investment needed, a huge amount of work needed in terms of building in resilience. Fantastic that the loss and damage fund was agreed, but when you're looking at that millions, billions, trillions shift, that's quite a way to go. So the private sector and insurance has a key role to play. So can you just say a little bit about the kind of actions you're seeing from that insurance sector?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jessica. And hopefully we will be with you in Dubai on Monday. But yes, I think it was very interesting what King Charles said in his speech this morning. Was that of his 5 points, one of them was specifically how insurance can help, and the other 4 really could easily be involving insurance. But I think I I haven't been to COP since the Paris one, and there's a reason for that. But I do think, and I think Rob alluded to it earlier, that this particular COP is a crucial one because it is where we're going to start to see the momentum shift. But I think one of the momentums is a recognition, and a number of people have said it as well as King Charles, is that the public sector can no longer do this by themselves. And whilst we kind of knew that a long time ago, I think over the last 8 years, it's taken this long to for them to get to this stage of recognizing that we're actually all in this together and we really need to work together. From the insurance sector, I see a lot of momentum. There's an awful lot of organizations in the insurance industry that want to use both sides of the balance sheet on the investment piece and on the underwriting. And I think, as King Charles said, he said the insurance has a vital role in providing and incentivizing sustainable practices. So that's sort of kind of inspiring, but we also need to get into the weeds as to what does that really mean. So how do we unpack that in terms of the investment side and the underwriting side? And I think we're not seeing, I would say honestly, from the insurance sector, we're not seeing a quick enough move to sustainable underwriting practices. It's not happening quick enough, and in my view, if you can measure it, it'll get done. Now, we are being a little bit overrun as a sector in terms of the regulatory side and the requests from governments for more information on what the industry is doing, which is all very well and good, but it's stopping us, allowing us to carry on doing the really good stuff, which is changing the way we operate, and that strategic plans we need to put into place for the underwriting side of the business. We have actually developed, along with Swiss Re, an SDG calculator, which we've rolled out this year. It's been hugely successful for all of the ICMIF members. We do want to roll this out to the rest of the industry as well at some stage, but it's the first of its kind that'll actually measure the impact on underwriting against the Sustainable Development Goals, of which climate is clearly a crucial part. We've also, in terms of the resilience side, so if you look at the big picture, and everyone's talking about resiliency now, the resilience piece, in order to do it, most people are asking how and what is involved and how can we get involved. There's not a lack of willingness, it's just a lack of how do we do it. So once again, with the UNDRR team, ICMIF has built a resiliency benchmark, which again rolled out this year. Our members are using it to start with, and we're already through the lens of the Insurance Development Forum, the IDF, which is quite a unique public-private partnership that was set up in 2016. We're trying to help engage all of the insurance organizations and reinsurance organizations in recognizing where they're currently sitting, which it's not a very positive position. But I think, being an eternal optimist, I do think, from what I'm hearing amongst all of the insurance sector, that we really do want to get behind these benchmarks. We do want to get behind measuring what we can do so that we have a base start, and then we can start to really increase the momentum, which I think is going to start to happen over the next few years. I believe we're at the bottom of the J curve at the moment, but it is going to be a J curve. It's going to be a really fast upwards momentum in terms of the learning side. So there's a couple of practical examples of what we can do, and I would say there is still a lot of talk out there, a lot of reports being issued. Okay, we do need some of those reports, but we do actually need real action and initiatives that can really kickstart the willingness that we're seeing with the insurance sector to get engaged, to actually be engaged and move that needle and make that difference.
Are there one or two that you can cite as examples of the kind of action that you hope that the wider sector might adopt? So particularly thinking of that insurance, the investment side of the equation.
Yeah.
You know, who would you hold up as doing some really interesting things in terms of driving investments specifically to climate solutions and resilience?
The investment side is absolutely crucial. As you know, this GFAN's quota is around about $130 trillion of assets, and if we're going to need $4 to $6 trillion just for the emerging markets a year, how do we maneuver that into that space? Because clearly it's not going to come from governments, so it's got to come from the private sector, and there are some really good initiatives that we're just working up at the moment, particularly with the UNDRR and the investment world and the insurance world. They're meeting at COP this week, in the Investment Advisory Board, which has some real high ambitions in terms of how it can mobilize that capital, certainly, and sort of almost backfill the space on resilience bonds, so they can retrofit into the green bond movement, which has been kind of ignored. The examples we're seeing is, from an insurance perspective, if we make people safer, our claims go down. We can keep the premiums at the levels they are, and therefore we're not going to find uninsurable communities, which is unfortunately what we're seeing at the moment. And we all know about California and people insurers pulling out of that state. It's happening all over the world, not just in emerging markets, and it's happening in developed markets where large pockets are not insurable, and that's going to only ramp up as we get more and more disasters. So surely it was in our own interest to actually use some of our assets to make these communities safer, and to make them more resilient. So actually investing through a mechanism such as a green bond or a resilience bond into the communities to get the work done that the public sector can't afford to do at the moment. But that we do need to work together on this, because at the moment, if we try and invest in some of these projects, we're not allowed to because of regulatory purposes or because government step in. So I do think there needs to be a real openness to want to try and come together, have a proper discussion that we're willing to do this, you need to let us do it, but it also needs to be done in a very professional way. It needs to be done on time and on budget, and it needs to be measured, the impact in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because if we don't get all of that in play, we're just carrying on the same way as we've done for the last 50 years, and that's not going to help anyone. So the willingness to want to do this, and the projects we're seeing, for instance, the cooperators in Canada are working very closely with the Canadian government, and the CEO will be at COP speaking at the Canadian place. There's some great stuff again going on in Sweden and for this area, Philippines. So there's lots of great areas that we can look at. The African risk capacity is another great example, which again, they're all present at the at COP this week. But some of the areas they're doing, not just around the parametric piece, but what they can do around the resilience bonds piece, it has a great potential. So lots of great ideas. Some of them are coming to fruition. And I think if we can actually pull all of the right people in the right rooms at the right time, and everyone would leave their egos at the door, and we can get something really done. But that's my hope anyway.
And as you say, we really do need that kind of turning point. So
Yeah.
progress happening, but we really need to accelerate the momentum. Mark, if I can come to you next, one of the other big themes which picks up to a degree on that point on resilience and is around nature, which we've really seen increasing focus, recognizing how rapidly ecosystems are being depleted and that link between nature and climate. So we know that if we don't reverse the collapse in nature, we won't have a habitable planet. And nature helps us to provide some of that resilience. It provides a carbon sink to help us tackle climate change, but of course is also negatively impacted by a heating planet. So can you say a little bit more about how nature is really being focused on and the kind of things that you're hoping to see come out of the discussions here at COP over the next 2 weeks?
Yes, and thank you, Jessica. The nature is actually probably about a third in most of the studies of the solution for climate. And yet, whenever we're talking about climate, we tend to think of the technical elements of it. And that's where a lot of the finance is going in. We're sort of ignoring the benefits that are going to come from nature. And in fact, we won't be able to deliver on the climate targets unless we include nature. It's all an integrated system. We know that. But actually, we somehow filter these things down into single issue problems. And that's part of the problem. That's why today actually has been such a good day with the announcements on food. Food is one of those areas where we start connecting up the whole issues around climate, nature, people, all of those issues together. So nature a few years ago actually wasn't involved in the COP agenda. It's only in the last few years we've been able to start getting the conversation to include that. Now we've got food, now we've got health on the agenda as well. And when was it? 2019, just before COVID actually, a group of us came together and started saying, well, we've got the 1.5 for climate. Nature's much more complicated. How do we do that? We decided that nature positive was a phrasing that actually all of us could get behind in the movement. And that's really got a lot of traction. A new nature positive initiative is being launched at the moment at COP this time. We've got the Nature Pavilion, which is bringing together a lot of events that are bringing those that have been working more on the nature space into the conversation to try and work with those that have been working on the climate space. We've seen some of those people that are putting the finance into climate solutions now also realizing and starting to invest in the nature space as well, realizing that actually you get double wins with this. Not only do you help nature and create spaces that people want to be in, but you're also achieving your aims on reducing climate. So there's an awful lot going on at COP this time round to try and bring those conversations together.
And you touched there briefly on one of the big announcements today, which is really looking at food and food systems. Can you say a little bit more about the significance of the announcement?
Yes, I mean, food is, we all need food. We can't survive without food. And yet it's something that is often pushed to one side in a lot of these conversations. And yet it's the basis of a lot of economic movements. We've actually been working through TEEB, which is the Economics of the Environment and Biodiversity, a program with governments, with different businesses over the last 3 or 4 years. We've worked with over 600 businesses in the food and agricultural sector to actually develop guidance which is now being applied. And as Shaun was just saying, we need to get to the point of action here. So it's about actually moving into action. And food is one of those places where we can see all of these issues coming together. And climate is not going to be solved again unless we can get to grips with the food system. Now, one of the challenges here is the subsidies. That actually what we end up having is a subsidies, perverse subsidies in the food system particularly. We think there's about 1.7 trillion around the world that are negative for nature. Well, a lot of those are in the food system or in oil and gas, etc., and things like that. Those subsidies are pushing us in the wrong direction. So this is a whole systems approach that we need to take with food, where actually we need to get the money to flow properly. We need to actually be able to give the tools and resources for people to work. We need to stop incentivizing people to do the wrong thing, which is what's happening at the moment. And this is where actually we're linking into the biodiversity COP. So there's 3 COPs. There's not actually just the climate one, which most people will be aware of. There's a biodiversity fund and also a desertification one as well, which many people will not have heard of. Why are we doing 3 separate COPs? It doesn't really make sense when actually the solutions are all integrated. We need to be bringing that together, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here. Food is one of those areas where we can really start to see some traction and see it happening on the ground.
Just picking up on that point, I mean, collaboration is something that is coming up in our work a lot. So, you know, I think we all know that we need different types of collaboration to achieve the kind of progress that we need to see. Can you share some other examples of collaboration that you're seeing that's really helping to bring together the nature and the climate discussions, but also thinking of some of the solutions that are going to tackle whether it's nature, climate, or both together?
Indeed, well, one of them is working obviously with you at Accounting for Sustainability and with the accountancy profession, the work that we're doing on valuing impacts and dependencies and really trying to curate that community. So we've brought together those that are actually coming up with ways to value, those that are regulating it, those that are doing it, the businesses. But working with you more recently, one of the things we're doing at COP this time is we're going to be trying to bring those that actually will be doing the work, not those that are making all these big statements. We need those statements, we need the vision. But what's actually going to happen on Monday back in the office after all of this is over is it's going to be an accountant that is going to be picking up the pen and actually doing the work. They're the ones that are going to be actually working out whether this fits into the business accounts, whether they can make the payments. So actually we need to bring them in, and we've been finding it difficult to find enough accountants that are coming to COP to fill our sessions, actually. So that shows you that it's needed, that they're not actually turning up. So that means our sessions are going to be very important, but we need to be able to convene them. There's one other I'd just like to mention, which is about accountability. So not just accountants, but accountability. Accountability isn't just saying that one person is doing wrong and I know better, which is often how accountability is heard. Accountability is once again a systems approach where all of us have responsibility for that. And there's several initiatives through the Global Commons Alliance, which I'm on the board of. We've set up an accountability accelerator to fund some of those grassroots initiatives. But we're also trying to bring together the science through the Earth Commission, which is setting the thresholds, the science-based targets, the task force for nature-related financial disclosures. We're bringing all of that together to build a better accountability system. Because we're now getting to the implementation stage, we have to be able to hold people account for their promises. We need to be able to support them in making sure they're going further than their promises. So that accountability system is going to be really key, I think, in this next stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's accountability at every level. So around corporates, around the investment community, around governments, and how we hold ourselves individually to account as well for the kind of progress we've made. And as you highlighted there, accountants and finance professionals more broadly, I think can play a really important role in keeping us all honest, looking at whether we're measuring the kind of progress systematically, consistently, transparently, and then tracking what we need to be doing into the future. Shaun, the same question to you. Yeah.
I was just going to come in on that because about a third of our members are agricultural insurers, which means they work very, very closely and very often support a lot of the agriculture in all countries around the world. So we feel this very strongly, and a lot of the messaging coming back from the farmers through their associations or straight into the insurers is that, look, we're not to blame for all of this, you know, just because we've got cattle and we're producing food. We are really trying to farm sustainably, and there's some wonderful initiatives and ideas out there as to how that might happen. So I do think there's a nice coalition there that we can actually work on between ourselves, the farming side and the insurance side, and there certainly is a willingness to want to work together on that coalition. I did mention the fact that we are coming together a lot more than we ever have done in the past in terms of talking to each other. And yes, Jessica, the A4S meeting this week in London was fantastic, and lots of different industries coming together and putting their ideas on the table. But I still think we're lacking the total engagement of governments. And we did have some there, and I've certainly, when I challenged the lady on my table. She said, yes, we need to be at these debates. We need to be around these tables. We need to understand how each other works. And if I can just give a short example, when we set the Insurance Development Forum up, it was the coming together of civil society, mostly the UN. It was coming together of the industry. It was coming together with science. It was coming together of governments. And it almost took 3 or 4 years before we actually understood each other's terminology and started to work together on projects. And now you can see some of the bigger outputs from the COP will be things like the Global Shield, which is the private sector providing the knowledge and the technology, but the government's providing a lot of the money to try and help emerging countries. So there's going to be some big announcements on that. But it's not just the macro level. I think it's the micro level that we need to get at. And the question I get asked regularly by the CEOs that we represent is, well, what does it mean to us? How can you put it in terms of saving the planet that I can understand and my customers will understand? And I think that's part of the messaging that the larger groups like ourselves can help their members with. So what does it really mean and how can they get started? And obviously, great. My answer is usually get yourself a net zero commitment. Now that's easier said than done, we know that, but the transition, or the just transition that everyone's talking about, is your roadmap. But I think you'll find in a lot of industries, if you're asking them to do a just transition, it involves a 25-year strategy, which is up to 2050. They'll say, oh, we've never had a 25-year strategy. You do find that in the mutual sector, I must admit, but in most sectors, it's a 3-year or a 4-year strategy. So you're asking them to think very differently to the way they've thought before. And this is where they need help and a little bit of guidance, which organisations like ourselves and yours, A4S, can really help their members get that strategy so everyone is on the same page. And I think ultimately that's, if we can do that and collaborate better with the other interested parties, we will certainly start to get a lot more success, a lot more action orientated outcomes from the great initiatives that are all out there in the business world already.
And Mark, coming back to you and picking up on the point Shaun was talking about there around the just transition. So we've talked about nature, we've talked about climate and the interaction between the two. We've touched on the fact that people need to be really part of the thinking. So clearly are going to be central to the kind of jobs of the future. And the kind of impacts that is going to have on the skills that we need. But of course, from a just transition perspective, there are some people who are going to be or risk being left behind. There are also many whose lives and livelihoods are being destroyed by the consequences of a heating planet. So can you say a little bit about where you would like to see the discussion during COP, thinking about that question of a just transition, and whether when you're interacting with the business community, you really see that front and center of the kind of thinking that companies are going through when they're setting their climate targets and their transition plans?
I think people are at the center of all of this. And when I start talking about value, it's actually value to people that we're talking about. So we're talking about, we need the climate, we need nature to be able to proceed. And the systems that we create around that, the economic systems, are there to help people to function. So, I mean, all of this comes together with people at the center, and yet people are often left out of these conversations. And you're completely right. I mean, it was really good to see at the beginning of this COP process that actually there is some movement on the loss and damage and the transference of money to those that are going to most need it. I mean, that's a really positive thing. One of the reasons we actually are no longer the Natural Capital Coalition, we're now the Capitals Coalition, is because we realized it's just as bad to look at natural capital as it is just to look at only financial capital. So, just to look at climate, just to look at nature, just to look at finance isn't going to work. You need to have an integrated approach. And we are at the moment actually developing frameworks and ways of thinking about those trade-offs. We make these trade-offs every day. I mean, if we're going to invest more in nature, does that mean we invest less in people? I mean, that's not going to work. We need to be able to understand that. It needs to be very clearly in the way that we account for it as well. So I do think it is left out. I do think that all of those people that are watching this, that have already started to get their transition plans and get their climate bit, they're starting to understand that, hopefully now. They know that nature is next. Well, I've got to tell you, it's also going to be people, and then it's going to be an integrated approach. So it's no use having a climate strategy, then a nature strategy. You can do them separately to start off with, but you're going to have to look at this as an integrated whole going forward. And you're going to have to think of those trade-offs. Otherwise, you'll have unintended consequences. So there are tools, the frameworks and work that we use at the moment. We've done lots of work, particularly with some financial institutions recently, helping them through that. And funnily enough, the first thing they come up with is actually we need the different departments to be sitting down with each other. That's the first thing we've got to do. And you would have thought that's really obvious. But they're not sharing information between each other. They've got different departments doing different things, and they're going to cancel each other out. So that's the really big learning, is that we've got to stop looking at this as a single issue. And I do think that this COP might be one of the pivots for that. We're seeing a lot of new things coming in. And don't be overwhelmed by the complexity of this. Yes, it's complex, but we deal with complexity every day of our life. And actually, we're making these decisions, but we're making them without the information we need. Get the information you need, and that comes through this sort of capitals approach, looking at it and being able to put it into your accounts, put it into the way that you think. Once you've done that, it's going to become much more obvious what you actually need to do. So don't be overwhelmed by it. Get on and start doing something now. And there's lots of people that are doing that.
And one of the things that has gone live again already at COP is a new knowledge hub from the ISSB. And certainly when it comes to the measurement and reporting side of things, I think that is a really good example of a great resource that people can use to help them start or hopefully progress rather than just get started now. We're nearly out of time, so I'm going to come to both of you just to share what you would like to see from COP28 from the next couple of weeks, and what success for this COP would look like for both of you before I come back here into the studio. So Shaun, if I can start with you.
What I'd like to see is a better collaboration around all of the parties, because we're all in this together. And if one part, the private sector or the public sector or the UN falls over, we're not going to get this done. It's great that we get the vision. It's great we hear the big plans, but ultimately it will come down to the people that need to deliver it. And I think if everyone that goes to COP takes away that responsibility, your business, your organization, your country has paid for you to be there, take that responsibility seriously and actually do something. Because if you don't, we're going to be in the same position in 2030. And as King Charles said, and I've said it many times myself, we're doing this not for us, because we ain't going to be around by then, or I'm not anyway, but our grandchildren will, and it's not fair. We have to act now, because there just won't be a world we recognise if we don't do it now. So that would be the one thing I would ask everyone to do. Science has spoken, they've given us the way forward. We now need to take that action, and we need to work on it together. And that includes at every level across all businesses. And that's one thing I am seeing a big change in our members, is they're not having a strategy anymore. They're not having a sustainability strategy. They're actually having a resilience strategy across the whole business. And if we can ask the governments to do the same, to have a strategy across their whole government and all of government strategy, and actually encourage us all by having their own just transition plans, so that we can hold them accountable for us as well, then we're all starting to play in the same space. And I think that's only going to be positive.
Thanks, Shaun. And Mark, to you.
This COP is a stocktake of where we've got to. So therefore, I think this has got to prompt more implementation. We've got to say, actually, we've got to be honest about it. And this is probably quite contentious to say. We're not going to reach the 1.5. And actually, I've been looking across all of the projects we're involved with and saying, do they need to change? actually, because if I'm designing those activities, those, you know, on the ground, the work that we're doing in Thailand at the moment, things like that, we're doing those projects, planning for 1.5. Well, that's not realistically going to happen. And I don't look at this necessarily as being completely depressing, because actually, I think we've all talked about the J curve and about the acceleration. It is going to happen, but we've got to be realistic about it. And that means we've got to start acting on this in the implementation, which is why for me, it is about bringing in those that are actually going to be doing the work now. That they need to be at the next COP, not this one, because they're not there, but we need the accountants in force at the next one. We need the people, the risk officers, we need people like that actually taking this on. This isn't just a CEO, CFO conversation. We need to get all of the others actually acting on it now, back at home.
That's all we've got time for in this broadcast. For me, just one final thought is we will see a lot more announcements over the next couple of weeks. A lot of them will be focused on action. I think you are increasingly seeing the kind of collaborative announcement that we've been touching on here between business, between the philanthropy and NGO sector, with government, really looking at how they can work together to overcome some of the very specific and more granular barriers that organizations and economies are facing in terms of achieving progress on climate. To the point that Mark was just touching on, it's not far enough and not fast enough, so we need to really double down. We will be back on air next Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. Dubai time. So for anyone in the UK, that's 4 a.m. GMT, an early start, a midday in Singapore, 3 p.m. in Sydney, and 11 p.m. Monday night in New York. So you can stay up and join us just before heading to bed. Please register on the A4S LinkedIn event, and we look forward to seeing you there. We'll be focusing on the news and developments at Finance Day here at COP28, something that hopefully we'll be taking forward some of the points we've been discussing here around the role that the finance and accounting community can and needs to play in driving action. So thank you for everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you back here next week.